Hi everyone, welcome to your library at home. My name is Rebecca, I'm part of the public programs team here at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that I live and work on Gadigal land, the traditional custodians of this land on which knowledge has been exchanged for millennia. We also celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal culture and language across New South Wales, and I take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and especially emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us online this evening. 2020, in the introduction of COVID to the world, created a strange and frenzied time for many. And in 2021, a lot of the same experiences are being shared again now. And so this talk tonight is very timely. This event is brought to you in partnership with the Sydney Review of Books, and we're very excited to have Fiona and Suneeta in conversation with publisher Ivor Indyk about writing essays, novels, and poems during the health crisis. We are hoping to take questions at the end of the conclusion of tonight's talk. So I do encourage you to use the Q&A feature of the Zoom app to type through your questions at any stage. Ivor will certainly moderate as many questions as he can at the conclusion of the talk. It now gives me great pleasure in welcoming to your screens Fiona, Suneeta, and Ivor.
Whoops.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
So I'd like to welcome you to this session, which is a collaboration between the State Library of New South Wales and the Sydney Review of Books, the preeminent online journal which specialises in the long-form essay. That focus on the essay may take the form of literary criticism, but it also features literary essays on a number of topics, allowing them to be explored in full. And one of those topics has been the COVID crisis, obviously, and the response of writers to that crisis. And recently, Suneeta and Fiona wrote essays for the Sydney Review of Books on their experiences and lives as writers during the last lockdown, not this one, though I think this one will also come into the discussion. I'd just like to introduce you to first to Suneeta and then to Fiona. Suneeta Perez de Costa has published and produced widely across the genres of fiction, non-fiction, playwriting and poetry. Her first work of fiction, Homework, was published by Bloomsbury in 1999, and her novella Saudade by Giramondo recently. It was shortlisted, Saudade that is, for both the 2019 Prime Minister's Award for Fiction and the 2020 Adelaide Festival Awards for Literature. And the American edition was voted a finalist in the 2020 Field Notes Tournament of Books. She's the recipient of numerous literary fellowships and awards, including a Fulbright Scholarship, the B.R. Whiting Studio Residency in Rome, and an AsiaLink Arts Creative Exchange to North India. Fiona Wright is a poet, essayist, editor, and critic. Her book of essays, Small Acts of Disappearance, Essays on Hunger, won the 2016 Nita B. Kibble Award and the Queensland Literary Award for Non-Fiction, and was shortlisted for the Stella Prize and the New South Wales Premier's Douglas Stewart Award for Non-Fiction. Her first poetry collection, Knuckled, won the 2012 Dame Mary Gilmore Award, and her second collection, Domestic Interior, was shortlisted for the 2018 Prime Minister's Literary Award for Poetry. Her most recent book of essays, The World Was Whole, was longlisted for the 2019 Stella Prize. Well, again, welcome. I have to say, I don't know who's going to go first. Suneeta, I introduced you first. Do you want to go first then?
I think he said we might read a little bit. Will that be a warm way of entering the conversation? Is that what we should do?
Yes, I thought just a few words about the essay and reading an excerpt from it, just to give us a sense of its flavour.
So my piece is called The 10,000 Things, and it deals with the pandemic. It deals with a period of illness that I experienced in the second half of last year, and many things. And it uses the Tang and Zen phrase, the 10,000 things, as a kind of invocation throughout, as well as this phrase about technology, because that was really what I was commissioned to do. And I continually couldn't write about technology. So the essay became, Katrina Menzies-Pike had asked me to write an essay on technology before the pandemic, like in February of last year. And every time I went to write about it, I couldn't, because of all these phenomena that happened. And so I'll just read from the beginning of it.
Suneeta, could you raise your voice or
sure. Is my volume not high enough? Is that?
Yes, well,
sorry.
Or get closer to the microphone.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So, the 10,000 things. The bag of drugs is sitting untouched on the kitchen bench beside the cans of diced tomatoes and chickpeas I'd earlier quarantined. They, cans, not drugs, may be useful, I think, although in less apocalyptic times, I might prefer to soak dried chickpeas to make hummus or chana masala. The chickpea glut follows a 9 p.m. masked assault of Harris Farm Leichhardt, and the fact the ex has recently turned up unannounced with a care package of more canned pulses, organic brown rice and greens than I have room to store. An Amma devotee, never known to hug spontaneously, he'd stood at the mandated distance of one Kylie Minogue on the other side of my gate, less gate than gate that never shuts properly, the broken latch I observed as he handed me the box, one of the 10,000 things now unlikely to be repaired. I hadn't the heart to tell him I already had enough chickpeas. Long before lockdown, I noticed he'd developed the habit of addressing me in the third person, as in, how is Suneeta? But this now felt part of the new protocol, kind of quarantining, albeit voluntary too. Was there anything else I needed? Actually, there was, I started. At one time, I would have settled for his child, but now the wit said, your urine. Deadpan, I added the citrus needed to be fertilized with testosterone, and as I didn't want to risk going to Bunnings, would be glad if he could oblige. He walked away muttering, you've got to be joking, but I called after him that I was serious. He could at least fill a few old milk bottles. It would soon be my birthday, and I hoped he'd come through. Afterwards, I went out the back to inspect the intensity of the lime tree's anemia. A familiar pain sliced through my abdomen, and the better to distract myself, I leaned in and hugged the paper bark. I am supposed to be writing this essay ostensibly on technology, but I'm distracted, enervated, channeling Pompey Casmalus, who, convalescing from Freddie heartbreak, office doldrums, and friendship ennui, travels on doctor's orders to a Schloss on the Baltic coast in Stevie Smith's Over the Frontier. It's the very eve of the Second World War, and she who confesses to being afraid of needles, Pompey, very, very bad soldier, is suddenly awoken to Allied duty. But caught in the freakish time warp of a new world order, I feel I could equally be fleeing Shen fever and holed up in a mall outside of Chicago with protagonist Candace Chen in Ling Ma's prophetic post-apocalyptic novel Severance. Should I go on a little bit more? Or is it...
well, you've got a little more time.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't time it, so I'll go on a little bit more.
Or I can ask you a question.
I'll just go on for a little bit more to give a taste of it, so that I don't have to be shy and speak. It is within these interstices of consciousness, existential intentions stripped to questions of contagion, to sheer utilitarianism, that thought, if thought it can be called, alights in those first days, weeks, and even months. But there are also blind spots and dead ends where it does not move at all, corners where it collides with dust balls or becomes entangled with ever-lengthening, ever-graying hair, whose, mine, on the floorboards. I am supposed to be writing this essay ostensibly on technology, but the rooms of the house have become a labyrinth, a game of snakes and ladders, a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle in which I am apt to forget my task or purpose. It's like no exit, except that hell is now self as much as other people. Marooned in ruminative cul-de-sacs, hideouts, cubbyholes, the inner child tumbles in too. Sullen when I refuse to play with her, she acts out. By day, she moves far away from me to return at 3 a.m. to disturb my already fitful sleep. When I wake, it is to snags of fear which I anxiously ravel and unravel in the manner of some very weird Penelopiad. Against prime ministerial advice, I cower from the cascade of woeful planetary realities and creep further under the doona. I decidedly don't want to be found, so don't bother to install the tracing app. The inner critic nevertheless discovers me malingering and asks, "Inner child, Suneeta?" Yes, I obediently answer. Like an imaginary friend? Yes, I aver. A Jungian fantasy, probably the result of a regressive ego doing service for the child you will never have. Ha 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 ha. Indeed, perhaps the only evidence of time passing will be my own extinction, my toenails growing intolerably long, scraping the bedsheet, or the susurration, the white noise of someone washing their hands and singing happy birthday to you, revealed in the streaky bathroom mirror to be none other than me, myself, and I.
Very good. Thank you. That's great. Fiona.
Yes. I'm sort of starting midway through. I was, one of the things I really like about your essay, Suneeta, is that kind of repeating refrain of I'm supposed to be writing this essay ostensibly about technology, because I felt like this piece was very much one where I was supposed to be writing something else, and this is sort of what happened. So this is kind of partway through. Sometimes I think that what made the difference for me last year was that my being so unused to regularity, to anything that isn't unpredictable or precarious, meant that when these things suddenly fell away, when the world for so many people became uncomfortable, unreliable, unstable, it didn't feel all that different to me. More often, I think it's because I first felt that shock of vulnerability, that realization that my body was always subject to forces that I could not control or predict close to 2 decades ago. It was bewildering and terrifying, and a destabilization that I felt at my fundament, my core. It took me years to come to terms with this, and the pandemic has granted no one else the luxury of time. Last year, I felt equipped. I've understood the precarity of my body and the limits of what it can be exposed to for years. I've had to moderate what I want to do with what I'm physically able to do for just as long. I've been isolated and lonely all my life. I already worked from home. None of these things needed adjustment. Early on, once the initial shock, that first wave of anxiety and wild speculation and fear had passed, I felt these as much as any other person, and I'm not pretending otherwise. I remember being startled by my new congruence with the world, the way that so many people were finding difficult the parts of my life that only now feel unremarkable to me. This too is something to which I'm unaccustomed. My experiences don't often fit the narratives that we are told about our world, what we can expect within and from it, but neither did the pandemic, which was why we had no way to understand it, nothing to measure or map it against, no way yet to find its meaning. The media kept calling it unprecedented, even though it wasn't. We'd just forgotten or ignored those parts of our history, looked away from those parts of the world. I felt like a precedent. New normal looked so much like my existing normal, and I wanted to tell everyone that they would be okay, that it would hurt a lot, but eventually they would be okay. At the beginning of the pandemic, both of my housemates worked in governmental offices that shut down suddenly. And over one weekend, they set up their clunky laptops in their bedrooms, one of them on top of a trestle table because she'd never had and never needed her own desk. It felt like the transition happened overnight. And in the first weeks especially, they were drifty and skittish, surprised by how the days all felt so long. One cooked elaborate lunches with multiple ingredients and many step prep. The other did load after load of washing. There was a lot of online shopping. Got to say, this year, the online shopping has been astronomical, but that's another story. We intercepted each other on the staircase and outside the bathroom and destroyed our internet connection one morning by joining 3 separate Zoom meetings at the same time. In the media and on the socials, people were joking about no longer needing shoes or bras, or despairing about their stir craziness, their boredom, the way their days all seemed to melt together. I don't know how I'm supposed to focus, one of my housemates said. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. It took me some time to realize it, but I took great solace in this. A strange and not uncomplicated solace, but a deep one nonetheless, in how difficult my housemates and my friends, the wider world, was suddenly finding the everyday conditions of my life. It was working from home that made this obvious. When everyone around me started talking about the shapelessness, the isolation, all of that time in one's own brain, how there's no way to diffuse any small madness or emotion that might build across the day, I felt something lift in me. I hadn't quite been able to admit that working in this way was hard. I chose this. Didn't quite believe in this difficulty when I'd felt it only in myself. I'd seen it only as my own weakness, some kind of flimsiness of self. I didn't know I needed this reassurance until that small but somehow deeply felt nugget of blame fell away. So much of the pandemic felt like this to me. Time and time again, I saw so many people struggling in so many small ways to adapt to the way I've had to live my life for so long. I kept remembering how much of an upheaval it had been to become ill, to adjust to this, but also how determined I had been to keep on keeping on, to grit my teeth to not complain. So much of the pandemic for me was validating in this way, and I was heartened. I've never felt so comfortable in my life. Should I leave it there?
Yeah, well, we can start the discussion if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So I think the two essays have very different tone, but nevertheless, they're both focused on the idea of the unpredictable and the precarious and the sense of vulnerability. Fiona, you talk about it in terms of suddenly what had been normal for you is now the new normal for everybody else, that sense of vulnerability.
Yeah.
And you explore that. Suneeta, for you, it's a source of comedy, at least initially, in terms of the opening of your essay. So I thought we might start with how that sense of disproportion or vulnerability or precariousness is experienced, and start with comedy, with humor, because that is, disproportion is the essence of comedy.
Sure. Do you want me to talk about the comedy?
Yeah, I'm interested because your essay is hilarious to begin with, at least.
I'm so glad it came off that way. I think if I look back, I was drafting because the commission had happened before I was unwell. I was drafting perhaps a little bit before, and I actually felt as though I had to find another tone to describe what was happening than taking it seriously, because everything was so overwhelming. So it was a deliberate kind of posture of voice, if you like. And of course it becomes much more, the content becomes darker than at the beginning. And maybe knowing that, I also needed to kind of find some levity to describe those other things that happen in the essay throughout. But yeah, this sense of disproportion, which has kind of been characteristic of the spectacle of this. What's one aspect of it? There are just so many elements. It's hard to kind of say, categorically. But for me, this kind of disproportion and that taking in disproportionate events, even now in what we're in now, seems to be something that needed a genre and a tone of mockery or derision somewhat, but also
Irony.
It's an ironic tone, yeah.
I mean, your essay is called the 10,000 Things. What do you mean by the 10,000 things?
The 10,000 Things is a phrase in Zen, I was about to say the narrator. You'll have to forgive it. Also the fiction writer in me also, I suppose, comes into play in speaking of voice in nonfiction. But the 10,000 Things is a phrase from Tang poetry, and in Zen it's a phrase Dogen is quoted in that essay, and the 10,000 things are the multiplicity, the myriad things that are actually in the essay about all the things that are in my mind, that are taking possession of my mind, that are things which can't be absorbed properly, and so they continually come up as objects. And I suppose the 10,000 Things is generally contrasted with oneness, or this idea of non-duality. So they're the two things that are going on, I guess, in that essay. The narrator, I keep saying the narrator like a fiction writer.
You know, I was just thinking.
Sorry, I just not very.
Yeah, I wish more people would talk about the narrator in nonfiction as separate from the writer. I think it's such an important thing. That's a whole other conversation.
An interesting one too, Fiona. But yes, the 10,000 things are the things which in that essay are accumulating, and it seemed like a very good metaphor for the weight of and freight of all the things in the pandemic, which were multiplying as things which can't be reconciled. So that idea of not being able, the self not meeting them, because they continually, yourself comes up against them and either finds them aversive or doesn't want to absorb them for whatever reason, or can't. And then hence all that stuff in there about strangers and others, and even the objects in the house become otherly. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I understood it in that way, that the suspension of the ordinary logic of things somehow released, you know, the 10,000 sources of anxiety, or the 10,000 places to which the imagination might go. Fiona, your essay has the title "On Being a Precedent,"
Yeah,
which is also subtly a nod in the direction of the suspension of the ordinary logic of things, because usually you're regarded as someone who's outside, who doesn't form a precedent for anybody, is actually an exception, an exclusion because of illness. And now suddenly your norm is their norm too.
Yeah, and you know, I know I'm not alone in feeling that. It sort of I was, as the sort of, you know, that first wave of the pandemic, what does a wave do? Crashed upon us, ebbed and flowed. As that was happening, you know, there was a kind of, it was something that I was feeling keenly to begin with, this idea that that everyone, especially I felt it a lot in the people who were physically close to me, so my housemates and the friends that I was talking to, that they were so shocked by the idea that they might get sick without meaning to, or not without meaning to, that there was this thing out in the world, an illness out in the world that was having an impact on their life. The idea that their lives would be affected by disease, I guess, or health, or this kind of wild, unpredictable force, was truly shocking to them. And it took me some time to figure out that the thing that felt so strange about that was that that's just so normal, as it were, for me. And I know this was a conversation that started happening a lot amongst chronically ill and disabled people, to kind of go like, yeah, this is how we live. And it was sort of, you know, I've been sick for a long time now, and when there's a lot of really useful and powerful and interesting conversations happening around what that means now. But that wasn't there at the time. You know, it really was a very individual, isolated and lonely experience. And it was one that I didn't have a way of understanding. So, you know, to kind of then see people in the wider world reacting the way that I had at that time, you know, I think it was in that excerpt that I read, really felt like it relieved me of some strange sense of guilt that I didn't even realize I had.
Suneeta, illness also features in your essay. I mean, in a sense, it's one of the 10,000 things, but it's a big one. Is it just a coincidence that both essays were about illness, or is it, as Fiona suggests, the prevalence of illness, which in the population at large and the threat of illness that brings it to the fore as a topic?
I think that existentially, this pandemic has, you know, made us aware, and I'm sort of in the essay trying to talk about that even before it's described that I fall ill. I won't call myself the narrator anymore. And the Fiona's remarks about this not being seen as ill, or having society adapt to the fact that people are already, they don't fit within this category of normal. I think that I related in some ways to that, but the illness I suffer from was a chronic illness, endometriosis and adenomyosis, and I'm not sure, Ivor, I'm answering your question about what exactly are you asking about illness during the pandemic? Sorry so that I don't waffle on.
No, I was simply picking up on the fact that both essays featured personal illness.
I think this is interesting. You know, so many of the things that I have read, your commentary or whatever relating, you know, in and around the pandemic have talked about this idea of it as an intensifier, this like intensifying issues that are already there. And I think that's like very much the case in this sense, that there's nothing that intensifies your experience of illness than it's suddenly being all around you in the world as well. Does that ring true for you, Suneeta?
Yes, it does. But what yours raises is this business of invisibility of certain things that became visible, and I think in that way, this phenomenon of illness that everyone might suffer from or everyone is afraid of is interesting. And because there's elements in mine about life and death also in terms of reproduction, and in Fiona's most recent beautiful review of Sarah Santilli's book, there's this thing about life and children, and I think that the illness part for me was also about living, being alive in one's body, in one's corporeal existence, and the relativity with this other thing out there of time, of the pandemic time and the virus time. And I've been finding that very interesting. And of course, when you fall ill, as I did very severely and suddenly with complications, and I was hospitalized for a long time, from July to October last year, that spectre is raised in a very acute way. You begin to think about how life and death is happening all the time. And so I've got this thing in the essay going on about breath. So when I came to write it, I realized I was writing about, I ended up getting lung clots in hospital from a complication within a week of being in hospital. And it became very scary for that reason. The prolonged stay in hospital was due to that. And of course, clots and everything have now become such an significant thing in our mind because of AstraZeneca. And I think that this idea of life and death and every moment became very palpable to me because of that experience. And this business of breath kept coming up because of the climate issue, the issue of the environmental catastrophe that we're facing, the fact that there's oxygen was a problem just before this happened in Australia. So this idea of not being able to breathe because of fires, and then and the George Floyd incident, and then breath because I had, a lung clot issue and so on. So these were things that I sort of just kept meditating on, I guess, after it all, and when I came to write the piece.
Fiona, do you want to respond to that?
Cool. It's a funny thing. Like I know, like the essay I was ostensibly writing was not about technology, but about work, and work post-COVID, as we were calling it at the time. But of course, this year has had other ideas for us. And so what I was actually thinking about as my way in was working from home, because I sort of, I sat down and I tried to figure out when I started working from home. And I'm not good with numbers in the first place, so figuring out dates is always a bit of a schmozzle. And I thought that was the problem. But the more I kind of sat down and sort of thought back through all of the different jobs I've done, I got to this point where I was like, oh no, I have always done this. I have always worked from home, and I've had sort of stints where, I've been in an office a few days a week, or, a job where we had an office, but it was somebody's home, things like this. So to me, the experience of leaving one's house to go to work is very strange. And not one that I'm well suited to either, it turns out. So I was very much thinking about and about that as a thing that I hadn't had to adjust to. But again, same as with that illness factor, when everybody was doing it and freaking out a little bit and finding that sort of sense of the days being a little bit, someone said elastic to me today, and I was like, yeah, it's elastic is good, but it's kind of floppier than that. I've always said just kind of like, like it's worn out elastic. You kind of get these lags and time does strange things when you're all by yourself in a house for long periods of time, and the sort of having to very much learn how to do that without having a model of what it was, that it was also reassuring to see other people start doing this and kind of go, oh, this is harder than we thought. So I was kind of coming in it that way, and sort of the more I thought about it, the more I was thinking about the strangeness of the experiences that I felt I was having during the pandemic, where it was, or during that first wave in particular, it was this combination of, that reassurance of people kind of coming around and seeing things my way, but also and kind of feeling that congruence, but also having these moments where I was like, oh, everybody is talking about how lonely they are. But suddenly my house is full of people and I don't like it. But there were still these moments where I was like, it's not like that. It's not like that for me. And kind of butting up against that too was quite extraordinary.
I'd like to pick up on that actually. This question of isolation and connectedness. Suneeta, your essay starts with the X on the other side of the fence. It does, close with a meditation, I guess, on childlessness. Can we just pick up this idea of isolation and connectedness? Do you want to run with that?
Sure.
Suneeta? Yeah.
I think it's present in terms also of the form of the essay, which keeps referring to technology and the alienating aspects of technology. So using Zoom and being afraid that I didn't know how to use it well, and I had an employer call me, prospective employer, and I had all these tabs open, or so many tabs open, because of course my mind was filled with so many things before. But alienation and isolation, I remember reading a couple of Patricia Lockwood's dispatches in the London Review of Books of her ordeal with COVID, or what was going on in the States, and I felt like I wanted to describe the alienation in terms of what was really happening to me in the house and with myself and with my feelings about other people, and even feelings about a lot of things we received, or I received, were through technology. So this constant mediation also, which is going on now in this phase of what we're going through, seemed for me to be an exacerbating problem with alienation. And I sort of satirize what it does to the narrator in the piece. But of course, there's the volatility also of relationships and what's going on in my relationship with India, and information I receive about that from my dad at one point. And there's also a lot of other experiences I describe in the essay of separation, and I think I describe it more as alienation more than I would describe it more an experience of alienation than isolation.
I thought it was interesting the way you split yourself. So you discovered an inner self, a second identity, and then you started splitting the space, the place, into littler spaces and alcoves, and suddenly space became full of holes, which became other spaces.
Well, that goes back to the heart of your question, which was about childlessness and the desire to have a child, with which the essay begins. And even today, I noted it down. I went outside for a walk this afternoon to try and kind of calm myself, and I saw those hopscotches which kept haunting me when I would walk last year. And there was one nearby and someone had done the child had done a unicorn with this rainbow coming out of its bum, and it said, "May unicorns fart rainbows all over your day." And I just felt like these constant, so there'd be these really terrible things happening, and when, in terms of alienation and isolation, I could see them happening with people in my midst who I engaged with, neighbours and so on, or people I mentioned earlier that at one point, it's not mentioned in the essay, I went to give my phone number probably in May or something last year to a neighbour who I hadn't seen for ages, and then a couple of days later, someone came to my door who wasn't the neighbor, elderly neighbor it was. This other woman came who was a nurse, and I thought, oh, something happened, what's happened? And that person, that she told me that that person had passed away. So there was this again, like you said earlier, Ivor, this juxtaposition. So I'm experiencing the knowledge of how this has affected the generations. It's had this generational kind of schisming as well, the pandemic. And it was particularly pronounced for me because of the prospect of not having a child or having a child, and what that means to us in planetary terms as well. Like, do we deserve to have children? What are children? Do they belong to us? And the sort of things that also Fiona has raised in a beautiful way in her most recent essay in Sydney Review.
Fiona, do you want to address that issue of isolation and
Yeah,
I'm calling connectedness anyway, but
yeah, it's a funny one, you know, because the I had another one of those very strange and complex and completely contradictory experiences too, where you know, like I said, my house was suddenly full of people, and I'm so used to having long tracks of time by myself that I found that really hard to deal with and noisy.
it's a share house. You're chronicler of the share house.
Yeah, little things too. Like if you work from home all the time by yourself, you sometimes forget to put pants on, and then, like, you know, there are people there, and you really shouldn't do that anymore. But you know, and I always maintain that the experience of illness is a very lonely and isolating one, because you know, you can't take anyone there with you. It's so personal and bodily and unshareable in many ways. But in this particular case, I mean, I'm kind of skeptical about the idea of technology as being inherently alienating too, because I think there are a lot of connections to be found there that are real and that are genuine, and that you know, have and do mean a lot to me. You know, especially when you're kind of not always able to do the things that you would like. And I know you'll be going batty without those, but my means of escaping this sudden no, that's not the right way of phrasing it. One of the things I did, because my house was so full of people, was that and this is in the essay too, that I started packing my computer and my books and everything that I was working with in a backpack, and walking to my girlfriend's house. So she's sort of a 10-minute walk away, and kind of working from, she was living alone at the time, and so you know, working there instead, because it was because it was an emptier house, but also because it was nice. And it was a sort of and that ended up being a very kind of strange, unexpected, lovely, wonderful thing for both of us, who were both people who are used to being alone, for, you know, for whatever reason, and for whatever end, and both people who didn't really expect to ever do things otherwise, I think. And we were both quite surprised to enjoy it and find it as easy as we did. So it ended up being this kind of very strange and lovely means of connection that I don't think I expected. And I think, and yeah, more and more, I think that's sort of maybe not immediately at the time, but after that first, you know, before we knew a second one was coming, a lot of people in my life kind of threw a whole bunch of stuff up in the air and changed things about, as if they'd kind of gone, oh, actually, I don't like this thing that I'm doing. Suddenly aware of that, that kind of being jolted out of everything they were expecting to happen, I guess, or kind of that smooth surface of the everyday into something a bit more alarming, seemed to shake other things loose as well in a way that I thought was really interesting. That sort of answers the question and is also a big digression.
Oh, that's okay. On the topic of digressions, I was interested to actually, I might address the audience here because we're going to continue this discussion a little bit, but then we'll open up to questions. So if anybody has a question, please write it down and I'll see it. But the question of digression, I was interested in the way the imagination works in isolation. Isolation is meant to be a great prompt to the imagination. And I wondered if you felt it. And I just wanted to mention one other thing, the difference, or come back to one other thing, the difference in tone between your two essays. Suneeta's is really allowing the imagination to run wild in a sense. It goes from topic to topic and really, captures a sense of how the imagination or responds in this sort of situation. Fiona, you, on the other hand, I think have a very strong sense of control, a very strong line of thought which you stick to throughout the essay, so that there's a kind of deliberate concentration on your part, and in Suneeta's a deliberate kind of opening out. I don't know if you'd agree with this characterization, but I thought it was interesting because it captured both sides of how the imagination might respond.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about humor, because I'm a big fan of humor. I think I'm hilarious. Not that everyone agrees, but I think humor is really important in essays, and I'm constantly putting in these little asides, for better or for worse, that sort of these little sideways jabs here and there, but they're largely missing from this piece, because I think that's because I started writing, and the more I wrote, the more I realized that I was just angry. it's probably the angriest piece I've ever written, and that made me really nervous for a really long time, because it's not my thing. But I think, and I know I'm not alone in this, and there's a bit later on in the essay where I talk about reasonable adjustments, and this idea that so many of the disabled and chronically ill people in my life have asked their workplaces to give them some flexibility and let them work from home a few days a week in the past, and been told that it's too difficult. But suddenly, when normal people needed it, turns out it wasn't that hard after all. It's infuriating to watch stuff that you have been denied suddenly happen because normal people need it, and that kind of that grew, and it grew stronger as I kind of kept writing, and
Suneeta, I don't think yours was anger, was it?
No.
The energy driving your essay wasn't anger.
I mean, obviously there's some quality of anger. I don't think that the political things that I describe in there, a lot of things are political, but the events about describing myself submerged in social media, and then the things that we witnessed happened to people. Of course, I think there is anger in the essay, but maybe the tone is I'm finding it difficult to describe what I did. I suppose I do feel angry about some of the things I described, but obviously in the essay they've been treated with this tone that you just from that irony that we were talking about. And
I don't do irony, I'm autistic.
And
Sorry, I've been wanting to use that line for a very long time, but it is true.
But whether that also, I hope it gives a sense not of my rage so much as shows how unseriously very serious things are taken, or sorry, how unseriously things that are serious are sometimes taken, or maybe I'm going off on the wrong track with that. But I do think there's a constructedness to what I was writing too. So I want to just say that there's a kind of that sense of what you said, Ivor, about opening out and the and this constant sense of leakage. Like there's actually leakage in there, and of course I have endometriosis, and that becomes a major problem. So this idea of constantly leaking, and the form itself leaking, and the things leaking out of the form, that was kind of like, it's a constructedness it's constructed. So as much as there's imagination in there, I think that also I was trying to craft it so it looked in the same way that Patricia Lockwood's essays were doing that too. This kind of feeling of the pandemic, the actual sense of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it went wild. Like, and it's also, there's that stuff about pangolin and animals, and I'm an animal and I'm made of.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, I'm wondering now that, like, I'm really fascinated by this at the moment, because I keep thinking about the uses to which, the metaphoric uses that pandemics are put in fiction, sort of a big thing that I'm working on at the moment. But illness in general, that's it's nothing new. It's that kind of the way that it gets used imaginatively or metaphorically, as Sontag would put it, is a kind of, is really broad and wide and long-standing, but a bit of a problem often for if you're a person who lives with illness, because it's not a metaphor and it's not imaginative, and in my case in particular, the stories that I had didn't fit, and that was kind of it's one of the things I keep thinking about at the moment is the way that when this all kicked off, and in that very early phase where nobody really knew what was happening or what to do or what to make of anything, I had so many conversations with friends where they'd say something like, it feels like we're in a movie. And to me, that's such an interesting and strange space, that this just sort of like, to almost not trust the world because of the imagined uses that these sorts of events have been put in the past. That's a bit convoluted, but I'm really interested in that process at the moment. Like, what happens when we're faced with the reality that we only have fictive or imaginative tools to deal with? What do you do then?
I'm being inundated with questions here. And since you're talking about fictive recourses in non-fiction in the essay, one of the questions is actually about the concept of the narrator, a fictional device in essay writing. Suneeta, you did raise that. Do you want to talk about that a little, or do you want to pass on it?
Probably got myself into some trouble saying narrator. It's because I'm probably writing fiction at the moment, so I was thinking in that way with that name. I suppose voice is something that's interesting for me, so maybe I couldn't have written, I'm just trying to be as direct as possible answering this, but I wouldn't have been able to write that material. Non-fiction is not a mode I feel comfortable with,
Mm-mm.
particularly personal essay. Although I've written a few of them, I don't really, I find them really hard, and confrontation with the self is the hard thing. And the narrator, the idea of having a voice, or like we were saying before, a form that can contain the things, the many things, the 10,000 things, is appealing to someone like me who finds it hard to just directly speak of the self. I'm probably obfuscating.
No. I think both of you, one marked feature of both your essays is the extent to which the I is dramatized. And to dramatize the I is effectively to turn the I into a narrator in a fictional sense.
No, and I meant what I said, that to me it has always made perfect sense to speak about and think about the narrator in nonfiction and in essays, because it's not, you know, the voice that you write with isn't all of you, or it's, you know, you could be, it's not that it's untruthful, but you know, you select what you say and how you say it, and how you tell a story. It's narration. And I think it becomes a really difficult, if you can't separate the narrator from the author, it's like impossible to write, but also it's impossible for people to read and critique the work properly either. But you, yeah, it's always a performed self. There's a term that I came across in some I've lost it a long time ago, but it was some academic writing about social media, which, you know, great genre, obviously. And they were talking about this idea of the voice that the people they were studying used on social media as their best hoped for possible self. But I really love it as a phrase, right? Because it's this idea of a version of yourself, but like obviously it's a projected best possible hoped for self, one who's smarter and more eloquent and funnier, and, you know, or more wry and ironic than you know you're capable of being in your day-to-day existence. But it, you know, it is dramatized and very separate. And to me, it's never felt like a great act of exposure for that very reason.
I've got a couple of questions here.
Just going to add, maybe we could say persona.
Yeah.
Like have a happy medium there. Persona, maybe persona non grata, depending on the
I've got a couple of questions here on the effect the pandemic has had on your concept of writing, on the nature, on the way you write, and how you think of yourself as a writer. Fiona would seem to suggest that it's only emphasized, you know, habits that she had before. But
well, I mean, I did have a moment early on where you know, the phrase essential worker entered our lexicon, and it was a very clear moment of going, oh, because everyone in my family is a teacher, a policeman, or a nurse, except for one person who works in a supermarket, and also me. So this moment was like, I am very inessential. Oh, what good is a poet in a pandemic? But you know, got over that quickly enough. It's a, yeah.
Suneeta, what do you think?
I think that, could you just repeat the question so that I don't waffle? Just the end of it.
No, it was just, you know, whether the pandemic,
how I work and
how you work and how you think of yourself.
I think the essay was also ironizing the experience of writing, hence not being able to write. I unlike Fiona, am much slower, and it's true that I it takes time for things to come together, and of course this constant interruption and the interruption of illness and the sense of deluge that we had with technology and had massive impacts on my capacity to sort of concentrate and be focused. So I've tried to ironize that in my piece. Yeah.
I have a question here about whether you have a message for writers or people suffering from illness at this time. Whether you have any tips for how they might deal with the situation as writers, or whether as writers or otherwise. I think that'll be the last question too, probably.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a hard one, right? Because I feel like one of the hardest things for me to learn to do was, and it was another writer who gave me this advice. So she said something like, some days the writing, the best thing you can do for the writing is not. And and then she added, and so you go and look at somebody else's art, or watch somebody else's movie, or read somebody else's book, or that side of thing. And she meant it as sort of as a creative block sort of a thing, but I took it physically that there are some days where and you can't predict which days they're going to be, which is the most incredibly frustrating thing about it to me. But to kind of recognize the days when you are pushing too much and too hard, and to just drop it and look at somebody else's art instead, because that is, I don't know, I think so much of writing happens when you're not writing, and that is thinking, but that's also consuming art in whatever form is the one that you like. To consider that work helped me.
I got that sense in your essay too, Suneeta. You did a lot of reading. It's, you refer to the writers you read, so I take it when you're reading, you're not writing. It is a good time for reading, isn't it?
It's a great time for reading. I've been reading more than I probably was reading before the pandemic. But I also think that being observant and all those details that are in that essay eventually compressed and tried to make meaning of them. A lot of them felt very meaningless at the time and painful, and pain, of course, doesn't seem to have any sort of imaginative or purposeful object at the time that you are experiencing it. It just feels like it's happening to you, or whether it's suffering from an actual, like an acute illness or chronic or mental suffering that's going on. And I feel like being observant, being a reader of the world is part of writing anyway. Being able to gather all of that, all the 10,000 things, all the dross even, and then turn it into something later. And whose timetable is it anyway, really? Given that we are in this life-death thing, I think that really became very clear to me during this time too, like what is the most important thing I'm doing right now, whether it's about writing or anything else in my life. Like how do I want to live, and what are the most important things I want to say if I'm writing? And if I can't say them while I'm writing, maybe I should do something else, like knit or make some nice food or something like that. But yeah, I don't feel I can give advice, but just that I think it's incredibly courageous what people go through. And I was particularly aware when I was very sick that people in Melbourne were having cancer treatment, and they must have been absolutely terrified, or people, so many instances that we're now in again of people suffering illness in a pandemic, and how terrifying that is.
Yeah.
I think we've run out of time. I really appreciated your talking so openly about many difficult topics, not the least of which was the writing of essays. And for those of you in the audience who haven't read the essays, I urge you to go to the Sydney Review of Books website. It's sydneyreviewofbooks.com, and it's easy enough to look up Suneeta Perez de Costa or Fiona Wright or 10,000 Things.
Yeah, we're Googleable.
On being a precedent, and you'll be able to read the essays for yourself. Fiona and Suneeta, that was really a privilege to hear you talking, and I'm sure the audience feels the same way. Thank you very much. Thanks.
So much.
Thank you so much.
Lovely to be with you.